As a game designer, there are very few things that I don't think games can accomplish. They've certainly taught me a lot, but what they never did teach was how to deal. A skill that I needed severely when I lost my aunt. My aunt died from cervical cancer in January of 2011. The illness came as a shock to everyone, and she was dead within a month of diagnosis. Watching my family deal with this grief was both awe-inspiring and absolutely devastating. Never more so than watching her three young sons having to deal with the loss of their parents. I so desperately wanted to help them, but being equally unprepared myself, there was nothing I could do, nothing that felt right. So I did what I do well. I made a video game. I realized very early on that there's a conversation that we're not having about grief and what grief actually is. So I started to research, and I started with probably the most famous psychologist who deals with this, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She talks about the 5 stages of grief. Most of you probably know them as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. She talks about the fact that grief is not an emotion, it is a process. And while it isn't linear, as in you can't expect to just go through these one by one and then be done, it is a process that you have to go through, and these are the emotions that you can expect from it. I wanted to go in further. I wanted to get a better understanding of what my cousins were going through specifically. So I looked into Ted EAL, a psychologist from Norway, who talks about the difference between how girls and boys, especially teenagers, deal with grief. He points out that girls are a lot more open when it comes to grief, a lot more willing to talk about their experience, whereas boys are a lot more introverted in their grief, a lot less open or willing to talk about their loss or their experiences. It was great to read something about grief, but I wanted to talk about it. So I conducted 3 interviews. One with a psychologist, Rita Paulsen, who deals with grieving teenagers on a daily basis. One with my teenage cousins, who had recently lost their mother. And lastly, I went to a boarding school to try and gauge the mindset of the teenager itself. Rita Paulsen, the psychologist, explains something relatively interesting to me. Grief in itself has 2 phases: the introspective and the reconstructive. The introspective part of grief is where you look inwards. You allow yourself to feel every emotion that washes over you in the face of this immense loss. Whereas the reconstructive is the place where you try and rebuild from that experience. You go back to what made you happy, and you have conversations and experiences that you would have had this not happened to you. What can happen if these 2 parts of grief aren't balanced is that the grieving person might end up suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder if they don't allow themselves to be introspective or to reconstruct the life that they had. They might find themselves emotionally ill-equipped to deal with everyday experiences. After I talked to Rita, I talked to my 3 cousins who had wildly different ways of talking about their mother. The oldest, who was 18 at the time, was very open about what he was going through, something that was very helpful in having a conversation with him. He would often proclaim his emotions and tell us how we might help. The middle child was a little bit more closed off. While he would talk about his mother if prompted, he never brought her up himself and never showed an interest in discussing the topic if not pressed for it. The youngest of the three didn't talk about his mother at all. Not if we asked, never brought her up himself. He was closed off to this experience, and didn't want to talk about it. Lastly, I went to a boarding school for free-form education, and I went through a scenario with them, a role-playing game, if you will, in which I spoke about grief abstractly. Now, what I was expecting going in was that these teenagers would be very straightforward, meaning I wouldn't be able to be very abstract in the way that I talked about grief. And what I realized was that they, in fact, were much more abstract than I was expecting. They were able to make very abstract conclusions on some themes that I had not expected them to be able to deal with. All this was boiled into the concept of a game called Unsafe. Unsafe deals with a young girl who has to walk through emotional landscapes depicting one of the 5 stages of grief. She has to look at and deal with these metaphors for depression or acceptance in a very broad sense. Knowing what I know now, I think I know that this way of expressing grief will help my teenage cousins express and give them the vocabulary that I never had when talking to them. So that was my talk, and thank you very much.